Thank you for joining us today on Intellectual Radio. My name is David Seaton, and you are listening to Humanity in the Headlines. Again, my name is David Seaton. I am the co-host. Our regular host, Atiba Buchanan, is out today. So I'm going to do my best to try and fill two shoes in our show today, as opposed to my normal, just playing half of the team. However, he is out today because his wife just crossed Zeta Phi Beta Incorporated. So she is a new member of that sorority, a member of the Elite Eight. So he is out celebrating with her today. So I just wanted to do a quick shout out to her, say congratulations to her, for all of our members who are all of our listeners, and everybody who's listening to us on Facebook Live and listening to us out there who are a member of Greek organizations. I'm sure you understand how it is when you just crossed and you are a neophyte. Are you a Greek person, Earl? Not Greek? Not at all? Neither am I. Neither am I. We've got a great show planned for you today. We're going to be talking about two topics. We're going to be talking about Russia. If anybody has been watching the news, you definitely have been hearing a lot about the Trump administration and their entanglement with Russia. We keep hearing about Putin and Russia and Manafort and Russia and Michael Flynn and Russia and all these people. And a lot of us might be wondering, what's the big deal with Russia? So we're going to be talking to Associate Professor Robert David English from the University of South Carolina. He's going to try and bring us all up to speed and get us calibrated on what's going on with Russia and the Trump administration. And then in our second hour, we are going to be talking to Attorney Kurt Mueller. And we're going to be talking about a topic that I'm sure is near and dear to a lot of people out there. We're going to be talking about child support. I know some of you just got mad. Some people just got mad for different reasons, but we are going to be talking about child support, and we're going to be talking about understanding men's rights with child support laws. I think that is a very important topic. I think a lot of people, especially younger people, enter into the child support system and they're not aware of their rights. They just make certain assumptions about what goes on and what they have to do and what they're not able to do. So we want to have a quick conversation and talk about child support laws. We're going to talk about it from the men's perspective predominantly, but we definitely want to hear from any women out there, especially women who are watching us on Facebook Live and who are listening to us. Share your thoughts and your experiences, good or bad, around child support. Men, share your experiences, please, around child support. We want to have that conversation today. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking to Associate Professor Robert David English, and we're going to be discussing Trump, the Trump administration, and Russia. We'll be right back. You're listening to Intellectual Radio. We are Humanity in the Headlines. We are back on Intellectual Radio. This is Humanity in the Headlines. I am the co-host, David Seaton. Mr. Atiba Buchanan, our normal host, is out this week, so I'm going to do my best to hold it down. Our first guest is the Associate Professor Robert David English at the University of South Carolina. He is an English on the faculty of the School of International Relations at the University of South California. I'm sorry, I said Carolina. University of Southern California, and served as the school's director from 2013 through 2016. He recently wrote the piece Russia, Trump, and a New Détente for Foreign Affairs. He said today the intensity of Washington's fury over Russia's misdeeds is matched only by its confusion over what those misdeeds are and its exaggeration of Moscow's supposed threats to divide Europe, to dominate the Middle East, and to undermine the United States. That's a mouthful. I just want to welcome to the show Associate Professor Robert English. How are you today, sir?
Good. I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
No problem. We thank you for joining us today on Humanity in the Headlines. We kind of set the segment up talking about everything we're hearing about the Trump administration, pretty much going back to Manafort during the before Trump got the inauguration, all through today. All we keep hearing about is Russia. We almost can't go an entire news cycle in a day without hearing some new story about Russia. For our listeners out there who are not completely who are still trying to wrap their mind around Russia and the danger that it represents, can you kind of sum that? I know that's a big question, but can you kind of give our listeners a little bit of reference point about why Russia is so dangerous?
Well, my argument is it's not as dangerous as it's currently being made out to be. That's why I refer to the sort of exaggeration or the extreme inflation of the threats that Russia is supposedly out to dominate the Middle East, undermine Europe, and even destroy our American democracy. I mean, we're hearing extreme kinds of threats like that ascribed to Russia now, and they're way over the top. Russia is an adversary. There's a lot to dislike about Russia, but Russia is a big, important country, and there are a lot of areas that we can and should be cooperating on to the benefit of both countries and the benefit of the whole world. But this kind of extreme Russophobia right now is getting in the way of that. And I'm no fan of Donald Trump, believe me, but I just noted that he campaigned, at least as far as Russia is concerned, with some very simple and common sense principles. That the problems we're having with Russia now are not entirely Russia's fault. We have made mistakes and been aggressive too, that we can meet them halfway, and that again, that would be to the benefit of the whole world. So I'm pushing back against what you described at the outset, this sort of Russia phobia everywhere, so that you can't go a news cycle without some more. Take, for example, the current hearings underway, what we saw this week. We know that some Russian intelligence, some cyber team in Russia in the election, and to the extent that the Democratic National Committee, they downloaded emails to WikiLeaks or made them available, and that embarrassed Hillary Clinton and was one of many problems in her campaign, not the only one. So that has kind of been inflated. It really has been inflated into some kind of tentacles of Russian power and propaganda everywhere in the Congress, Capitol Hill, our media, to undermine our democracy, when in fact it was just an operation to embarrass Hillary. I mean, good grief, the Russians could not have known 9 months, 6 months ago, any more than we did, that Trump was even going to be the Republican nominee. And have turned a small thing into a big thing, and got a little hysterical about it.
Right, and I just want to follow up, because I wanted to kind of set the tone for the conversation, just because a lot of our listeners, all they know is what they see on the news, and all they've been hearing is that Russia is the villain. But it would be very, very naive of any of our listeners, and for us here in America, to start from the assumption that the United States has never intervened into any elections or tried to install their puppets or their people of preference throughout the world either, correct?
Yes, more exactly. That's the next thing we would go right to, beyond the general climate, which is that from the Russian perspective, and not without some justice, are getting so heated up over some hacking and embarrassment and turning it into sort of a national threat is hypocritical. not only in Latin America, right? We helped topple Allende to put Pinochet in power, and we did the same in Iran, and we did it again and again in Central America. Not only those examples, but people forget something much more recent, which was in the 1990s. We directly intervened, meddled, played a critical role in turning Russian politics in the direction we wanted. We helped them in various ways, fraudulent constitution in 1993. And then in 1996, we directly intervened with money, with influence, with political support to help a deeply unpopular President Boris Yeltsin get reelected,
right?
Because he suited our interests. I mean, that was an intervention. Those were interventions in Russian politics that dwarf what Russia has now done back to us. And two wrongs don't make a right. Instead of, if I seem like I'm justifying what Russia's done, I'm not. But it's a real wake-up call for us maybe to change our course and realize how we look to other nations in the world. And if we don't want to be, have a lot more of this in store for us, maybe we need to modify some of our policies that are full of double standards.
I definitely agree with you on that. I am definitely not one of those blind, patriotic sycophants of my country. I believe that your first responsibility as a patriot is to question authority at all times. Having said that, though, let me pose this question, because this is the one thing I keep hearing, and you kind of alluded to it, but this is the one thing I keep hearing from Republicans on the right when they keep saying, well, I mean, the Russians intervened into our election, and yes, they had these thousands of bots, and they did this and they did that, but there's no way they could have known the outcome. There's no way they could have known what they were going to do was to be successful. But the problem with that argument, in my opinion, correct me, and I want to get your opinion on this, but my problem with that argument is that if you're going to say that spending all of this money and time and human capital in trying to influence the election without knowing the outcome, if you're saying that those two things are not connected, then we may as well just stop spending money on elections. I mean, the reasons that we spend money on elections and we buy commercial time, and that politicians spend money to get on the radio and get on television and get themselves in front of their constituents, is to influence their vote by presenting a certain point of view. So isn't it disingenuous to say, on one hand, that we acknowledge the intervention of Russia, but then say that their intervention is completely not connected to the outcome?
You're right. You make a good point. And then the mystery becomes sort of trying to untangle or assign weights of influence to the various factors that determine the outcome. Some people would say, yeah, the Russian intervention, that mattered. And since Hillary only lost by a few thousand votes or 10,000 votes in these three states, it might have been the critical factor. Another person looks at the same situation and says, no, she lost many more votes by doing this or by not doing that. And James Comey and his FBI letter at the last minute that turned out to be a red herring hurt her deeply, and her husband's this, and the attacks there. So I don't know. That's for domestic elections experts to try to parse through. But there's no doubt it was a factor. I just am not an expert in that area, and I'm just saying, let's cut it out, right? Here's what I'll follow up with. And this is what gets difficult, among many things, in arguing sort of to a public audience. One thing that wasn't mentioned in your intros, I worked for 3.5 years in the Department of Defense and another couple of years for the Committee for National Security. Now, I was not, and I am not, expert in cutting-edge cyber and cyber war capabilities, but I know enough generally about the defense and national security world to know that we only hear the half of it publicly.
Right.
And I also know that we have the best cyber and cyber warfare capabilities out there. And what I'm suggesting is that we do a lot of the same thing.
Sure.
People must remember that the NSA, thanks to Snowden and other revelations, was caught eavesdropping, listening on the phone calls and reading the emails of even allies like Angela Merkel in Germany,
right,
and Netanyahu in Israel. We are all over the Kremlin, believe me. We are downloading things, we are breaking in, and it's what we all do. The Chinese are at it, the Chinese. I mean, this is my first response when this hack became public. It was, really? This is a big deal? Where were these people when the Chinese broke into the Defense Department and stole all the secrets of stealth technology for the F-35 strike fighter. That is serious cyber war. That is serious theft of national security documents. My first thought was, Jesus, this is just unclassified gossip from the DNC. But you're right. You're absolutely right. It did help turn the election. It came at a critical time that embarrassed Hillary. But my reminder about other cyber war and our own cyber war capabilities is just to set the broader context so that people don't think that everything was rosy, everything was fine, everyone was being respectful and playing by the rules, and suddenly the Russians did this. That is a distortion. We've been doing it. Russians have been doing it. Chinese have been doing it. Freelance operators have been doing it and continue to. And maybe we need to address this like they were nuclear weapons and have some treaties and some limitations. Because right now it's an arms race, uncontrolled.
Right, and I'm glad you kind of segued into nuclear weapons, because that was going to be my next question. Isn't the larger concern here, you bring up good points when you bring up that China was involved in getting our secrets of the F-35, that certainly we live in a world where we have to constantly be on guard from technology, and that's a new front. I would also submit, and I just mentioned this parenthetically, but I would also submit that one of the reasons and one of the biggest impasses that we have to really implementing a technological strategy to protect ourselves is that for the most part our country is being run by a bunch of majority baby boomers who really don't even appreciate and can't even wrap their arms around the technology. I remember one senator in an open hearing, he made the metaphor of the internet being a series of tubes. And that takes you back to the 20s and 30s when people would, put everybody's been to the bank where they send the tube, or they send the little canister through the tube, and you put your money and your deposit slip and you send it back through the tube. I mean, to think that the internet, or that that our technology works like that, and that's the best analogy he could make. That's kind of one of the impasses that we have in this country, isn't it?
You remind me, you're absolutely right. We've got a guy now, Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry,
right?
Former governor of Texas. Wasn't he the guy that about 5 years ago said something about, I'm going to have to get me a computer and get on them interwebs?
Right.
How was this guy technologically adept enough now to manage our nuclear stockpile and all the nuclear research?
He didn't even know that the Department of Energy was in charge of our nuclear stockpile.
That's right. So you're right. Nothing wrong with being a baby boomer, except they're from a previous generation. Me too. I'm kind of on the cusp. I try to keep up. But,
well, no, that wasn't an insult against baby boomers.
No,
I'm just making a distinction generationally between. I remember when I was in high school, it got phased out. But I remember when I was in high school, my freshman and and I'm dating myself here, but in my freshman and my sophomore years, people were still taking typing classes. So, but now my daughter, my daughter, when she was in junior high school, she was turning in her homework on Google, Google Docs or Google Drive. So, that was just a generational consideration that I was making, or observation I was making. But to the nuclear issue, though, of all of the countries, and I think there are, you might know this better than me, but to the best of my recollection, there are about 11 or 12 countries that have nuclear weapons, and there's about 16,000 nuclear weapons, give or take, in the world. But of those 16,000, 14,000 of them are owned approximately by the United States and Russia, about 7,000 each. So that up is, we really do have a motivation, kind of to your earlier point, if for no other reason that the United States and Russia are equally matched in their nuclear arsenals. We really do that should really be our biggest motivation, perhaps, to try and find some common ground to deal with Russia. No?
Yeah, you make another really good point, because just 25 years ago, when things were starting to change in Russia, Gorbachev had come to power. He was launching these sweeping reforms, his perestroika, and that led to deep cuts in nuclear weapons, essentially the end of the Cold War. There was an urgency. We all understood the urgency and the tremendous impact of what he was doing, because we had just been living with an entire generation of the Cold War, of the nuclear threat. serious nuclear threat. And we had confrontations over Berlin and especially over Cuba that brought us to the brink. And now then it went away, right? The Cold War was over. We both cut our stockpiles quite a bit. We didn't have our weapons on hair trigger and all of that. And slowly we've crept back, right? We're now in confrontation with Russia. It didn't happen overnight, but various events and the war in Georgia, crisis in Ukraine, now Syria, and we've slipped back into confrontation, except we don't have that urgency hanging over us of the danger of nuclear war, and we better be careful. We better halt this. We've got complacent. We've grown complacent in the meantime. And I think most people have forgotten what you're pointing to. Believe me, once you've been inside the Pentagon, once you've seen some of the plans, the contingencies for nuclear war, you understand very seriously. But we've forgotten. Remember movies like The Day After and the huge anti-nuclear rallies in New York and the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Europe.
Right.
So much awareness of how close we were and what these weapons would do in a crisis if accidentally launched. Well, and again, you're right as well. 25 years ago, there were only 5 countries, except counting Israel, which was secret, right? But only the U.S., Russia, China, Great Britain, and France were acknowledged thermonuclear powers, and then Israel on the side. But we've had India, Pakistan, North Korea, and those weapons are spreading. They'll continue to spread. Right. Maybe Iran someday. And it's just mathematical inevitability that at some point in the future, someone's going to accidentally use one. And that plus these kinds of armed standoffs we're having where we are up against the Russians almost face to face in Syria, in Central Europe and the Balkans. It doesn't take much imagination to see something could happen accidentally.
It's a historical irony when you think about the Republican Party today and you think about Donald Trump being the standard bearer for that party, when we think back only 2 generations ago, less than 2 generations ago, that Ronald Reagan was trying to negotiate getting rid of all nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia.
Yeah, and Donald Trump, I don't know what to make of him on this. Number one, he does not convey confidence because he has so little experience, because he's erratic, because he seems so narcissistic. God knows what he would do in a crisis with that button near his finger. But the second thing is he doesn't share that urgency. I mean, one day he says, we could cut nuclear weapons with Russia. The next day he says, that treaty was bad. The Russians have more. We need to build up. So he's all over the place. And if he was consistently a hawk or consistently a dove, you could understand that. It's even worse when he's consistently nothing, because then that just conveys confusion, and confusion is danger and instability.
And just as a side note on the whole nuclear, like Donald Trump saying we need to modernize our nuclear arsenal. I don't know that there's a whole bunch of difference to the person on the ground if they get hit by a 40 kiloton nuclear bomb that's 40 years old or 4 years old.
It's very easy, unless you're really well versed in national security issues of all sorts. It's very easy to come into office, whether you're a congressperson, a senator, a president, a secretary of some department. It's very easy to come in and become captured by the dire threat assessments and the extreme demands for new funding for new programs that you'll encounter inevitably on the part of the armed services, on the part of the nuclear labs, and so forth. All those guys are paid to see threats. They are paid to think in conspiratorial ways. They're paid to see the Russians or the Chinese around every corner.
Right.
And they are simply institutionally incapable of doing anything but crying wolf all the time.
Right.
And it's really tough. One of the jobs, and Eisenhower understood this way back in the 50s when he cautioned about the military-industrial complex. He understood that we created this massive defense establishment where all the generals and their civilian supporters and also all the contractors and defense companies were just institutionally incapable of doing anything but rattling sabers and sounding the alarm. And it took a lot of guts and savvy and knowledge and political skill to constantly push back against that and keep a balance. We would be spending out the roof. We'd have like a defense budget that's 80% of federal spending.
Certainly.
If the military got everything they say they need. It's tough to say no to them. And again, a team like Donald Trump's comes in with so little experience in this area And I can just imagine, he or one of his secretaries goes over to the Pentagon for a briefing, and they come back and say, "Oh my God, we got to double our arsenal, or else the Russians will take over tomorrow."
Right.
And it's easy to, if you're not smart and you're not experienced, it's very easy to be manipulated, to be trapped in that. So a rookie president with rookie advisors, especially, is really dangerous.
Finally, and again, I want to try and contextualize this whole Russia thing, because I think you've given us some good information that a lot of this might be rattling the saber, a lot of this might be hyperbole, and it's really incumbent on us as citizens to really take all of the information that we're getting with a grain of salt, as it pertains to Russia, as it pertains to everything that we've been told. But isn't the larger issue, let's go ahead and let's just assume that everything that we've heard from the CIA and from all of our intelligence departments, let's assume that all of that is true, that Russia did everything that they did the whole 1,000 bots, and they hired all of these people. And let's assume that everything that we've heard from the CIA on down about Russia going back 6-8 months, let's assume all of that is true. Isn't the bigger danger and the bigger threat to democracy, and this isn't hyperbole, isn't the biggest danger that we really need to look into is the possibility of collusion between the Trump administration during the election, during the transition, and now in the actual White House? Isn't the possibility of collusion at each of those three steps and between them and Russia the far larger threat that we really need to be concerned about?
If they did that, and whether it was Michael Flynn or Flynn acting at the president's orders, the president himself, because he has big loans from Russia, not to mention the whole business of prostitutes and all this, whatever leverage they supposedly had on him, on other members, Manafort, the rest, if it's true that in some fashion, high officials now in the Trump administration knew about the hacking and the leaks, and much worse, coordinated with the Russians to time the release to maximally embarrass Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump, that's really bad. And that makes him an illegitimate president. That cripples our political system. I don't know where we go from there. It certainly makes it impossible for Donald Trump and his team to do anything with Russia except status quo. Any change, any initiative will be seen with the deepest suspicion, and justly so. If they colluded in that fashion, we would be facing a crisis of betrayal, of treason, of breaking every possible national security stricture imaginable, and it having been done by our elected president. However, the other possibility is that there's a lot of smoke here and very little fire. And what I suspect we'll discover is that people like Manafort and Flynn, we know they were taking speaking fees from Russian state television, or paid for a visit or appearance. We know that some of them did consulting for some shady oligarchs who are pro-Russian or Ukrainian thugs. We know that there's a lot of sort of sleazy political money sloshing around, and some of it may have been stashed in Cypriot banks, or they didn't declare income on it, and there could be tax issues. That might be what Flynn is about, why he's looking for immunity. Chances are better than even that that's what's there, and not a political plot. If it is the latter, then it's tremendous.
Right.
Absolutely right. But there's a good chance that what this leads to instead, it's going to remind us of the George W. Bush administration, where you had all these oil officials and Halliburton and all the rest with direct ties to Dick Cheney and others, who are suddenly now going into Iraq, giving out contracts, single source, awarding big deals to their cronies, and that it's more financial malfeasance and tax dodging than it is treason and political manipulation. I don't know. That's just my suspicion.
Well, even having said that, and those are both great points. I mean, just to kind of dovetail on what you said earlier, I wouldn't say that it's really bad. I would say it's treason if the Trump administration was involved. But let us not forget that even if Manafort and even if Flynn, if all they did was take speaking fees and didn't declare it on their taxes during the election, they tried to lambaste Hillary Clinton for taking speaking fees for speaking to United States banks, and because she wouldn't release the transcripts, they implied that there was some, to use your word, some malfeasance going on. So even if it was something as simple as that, that's still news, is it? I mean, I think that's the bigger point for whether we're talking about the Trump administration or Russia or anything, it's just the hypocrisy. You've got Flynn during the election saying if you ask for immunity, then you must be guilty. Now he asks for immunity, and Trump says, well, of course he should ask for immunity. It's a witch hunt. I mean, that's the biggest thing about this whole Russia story and the Trump administration is that there is just no end to their hypocrisy.
Yes, and sadly, because of all that, which is mostly our domestic politics, but super important, no doubt, it's hard to imagine that any progress on U.S.-Russia relations is possible because we're paralyzed, and we've paralyzed ourselves. And the Trump people have, with their incompetence and their malfeasance and their hypocrisy, created scandal after scandal. And as bad a guy as Putin is, I still think he's somebody that knows limits and we can strike a deal with. But he's watching, and all of Moscow is watching with bewilderment how this administration, during what should be its honeymoon phase, when it has its greatest power, its greatest leverage, its largest amount of political capital to spend, has instead tied itself in knots and it's like on the verge of a Watergate type of implosion. It's just mind-boggling. We are in uncharted waters here. It's endlessly fascinating, but none of it's good for the country. I still think that in the bigger picture, we need to and we can find accord with Russia. But all that you and I have just discussed cannot make you optimistic it's going to happen anytime soon.
Associate Professor Robert David English, we really appreciate you joining us today on Intellectual Radio on Humanity in the Headlines and discussing this very complex topic. I'm sure I know we could talk about this for another hour or two and we'd just be scratching the surface. But for our listeners who want to follow you and find out more about you, go ahead and tell them how they can follow you, what they could get, your books that you have or anything to the like.
Oh, well, they just need to go on the website, University of Southern California, usc.edu, and track down myself, School of International Relations. I don't tweet. Maybe I should. But they look at my name, Robert.
Maybe you shouldn't, given who our president is. Maybe you shouldn't.
Maybe I shouldn't. And but they can track me down to the university and my name, and they'll find this most recent article we've been discussing on Trump and Putin and the possibilities of a new détente, which you and I have basically just buried. I think they can find that at the Journal of Foreign Affairs.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being on, and we will definitely be in touch. And we're going to have to follow up and do a part 2 of this conversation, I'm sure, sometime within the next 6 months.
Donald J. Trump will make sure that we have plenty to talk about.
That is
That's
true.
One prediction I can confidently make. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and have a great day. All right, that is our first half hour trying to dissect Trump and Russia. We will be right back in a moment. We're going to be talking about child support and men's rights. Those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, go ahead, share this show. We want to make sure we get your comments on this next segment about child support. You're listening to Humanity in the Headlines on IntellectualRadio.com. We are back on IntellectualRadio.com. This is David Seaton, the co-host of Humanity in the Headlines. For those of you who are watching and listening, Atiba is not joining us this week. He is out celebrating with his wife, who just crossed Zeta Phi Beta. So again, congratulations to her, and we will see both of you very soon. We have with us now Attorney Kurt Miller. He is the principal of the Muller Firm Ltd. Limited, a Chicago-based family law firm concentrating in hearings, trials, and appeals concerning divorce, custody, and family law for the last 30 years. He is the author of 3 books and numerous articles regarding family law, and is a frequent lecturer on family law matters to other professionals in his field. He has also been the host of Chicago-based television shows and the nationally broadcast radio show Uncommon Law, which has been heard both over the CBS and Air America networks. He is currently working on his third edition of his seminal work, In Consideration of Divorce, and a nonfiction collection of anecdotes rising out of his more than 3 decades of practice, tentatively titled The Uncivil War. Thank you for joining us today, Attorney Muller.
That's right, and everything you said is absolutely correct because you can always trust a lawyer. You know that.
We're definitely going to trust you to guide us through this conversation today. We wanted to have you on today because we wanted to talk about the current state of child support, and we wanted to talk about men's rights specifically as it pertains to child support. Now, for those of you who are listening, and for those of you who are watching us on Facebook, and again, those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, make sure you post your comments and your questions. Attorney Muller, when you hear men's rights, it sounds like you're implying, or it sounds like one might be implying, that there is an intrinsic bias in the child support system. Comment on that.
Frankly speaking, I think of men's right as being a marketing tool. There is a particular attorney in the city of Chicago that uses that moniker, and he is more or less synonymous with the terms men's rights. And I take a little bit of offense to it because I believe that courts should be gender neutral, should be color neutral, should be religious and creed neutral. So when you start off on the foot of thinking that men have been oppressed, then you're starting with a chip in your shoulder that you're bringing to the court. And I, in my experience, have found that this is not a successful way to attack things. I think you stand on the issues. We have found, and if I say we, I speak in the third party we, but I have found, my firm has found in over 30 years of practice, that the shifting of rights, the shifting of appreciation for the ability of men to parent has changed them dramatically. And what we have found is that in cases where men are seeking custody of children, there is no bias. A man has just as good a right of receiving custody. And well, of course, we don't call it custody anymore. Now it's called parental allocation. That's supposed to assuage people because they say, "Oh, my wife got custody." Now they don't have custody. Now they have just varying degrees of allocation of time. And it's the politically correct. It's the attempt of the courts and legislature and society to be politically correct. It's like every child that runs a race gets a trophy, whether they're first or sixth. And I really do take some philosophical problem with it, but that's what we're at. We look at parents that are receiving certain allocations of time with children, and as I said, men, women, both have an equal right to allocation predicated on the respective circumstances and the needs of the best interests of those children. So I want to get that out of the way. I don't want to talk about men's rights per se, because in women's rights, then you have the idea of feminists versus men and Trump versus Hillary and all the baloney that goes with this stuff. And I think that we have just picked at the scab so long that it's festering. And I would rather see people cooperate for the best interests of their children rather than to see them polarized along sexual or gender line.
Well, having said that, and I certainly agree with you, and I am a parent, so I certainly agree with you that all decisions that are made should be in the best interest of the parent. And I would agree with your earlier statement that courts should be gender blind, color blind, and religiously blind. However, we know that the courts are ruled by judges who are people, and people come in with their individual biases or points of view. So while on paper and idealistically, it's lovely to envision this world where everyone is treated equal. I think we both know that that's not the case in reality. Having said that, though, statistically in the state of Illinois, about 17% of men have sole custody or are the sole custodians of their children. So when I look at a statistic like that, right off the bat, I would it would make me feel that there's some sort of bias, because if only 17% of men are sole custodians, does that mean that none of the other fathers petitioned the court for custodianship? Or again, is there some intrinsic bias in the family court system that starts from the assumption that the mother should be the parent, or is the best person, or the best person to be the custodial parent?
Well, I think the number is skewed for lots of reasons. For one thing, if you consider all the children in the state of Illinois, if we're talking about the state of Illinois, there are children of marriages, and then there are children that are born out of wedlock.
Correct.
And in many of those cases, I'm sure you and the listeners will recognize the fact that there's a lot of parents, a lot of fathers particularly, that have fathered children and have taken off. They can't be found, or they don't step up to the plate. So that in itself kind of skews the figures. A lot of women are, quote unquote, stuck with the children. And I don't mean that women are stuck with the children.
Sure.
But what I mean is there are situations where they have a child, they're responsible for the child, and they don't have a man in the child's life. We can postulate all the problems that have arisen in our society because children don't have strong male figures to reflect upon them. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of guys don't step up to the plate. They want to duck paternity. So if you think of all the cases that are in, let's say, the Cook County system, and I use Cook County because I practice in Cook County primarily, you'll see that out of parentage cases or divorce cases and paternity, or what we call parentage cases, I would say that a good sum of the children that are in play in terms of custody or parental allocation battles may arise from parentage cases. And those are situations where the fathers don't want to be involved, or they're trying to deny the paternity. Now, put the shoe on the other foot for a minute and go back to divorces, where people acknowledge that they have children, they want to have children. You know, it's a very, very rare thing, whether somebody is an airline pilot or a doctor, or they're pushing a broom, because we have all kinds of people that come to the Muller firm. It's a very rare father that doesn't want to have anything to do with his children. Obviously, if a man says that he doesn't want anything to do with his kids, he just doesn't care, we tend to view that with disdain. But I would say that 98% of the men that walk into the door, they want something. They want a life with their children. A lot of them want custody. A lot of them, sometimes I believe that the desire, and I'm going to use the term custody because that's a term that's familiar with the audience rather than parental allocation, which is the new vernacular. A lot of people want custody, or a lot of men may assert that they want custody because they don't want to pay child support. And that's a whole different thing. That's a motivation for entirely the wrong reason. And a lot of times you'll find, particularly now that they've changed the allocation laws, fathers are looking to get 50% of the time. Fathers are looking to get 51% of the time, because then they're going to have an argument that they don't have to pay any child support. That is being remedied by the new statute on child support, which comes in effect in July of 2017. And I presume you and your listeners probably want to talk a little bit about that today too.
Well, let me before we even go there, let me just kind of coattail on what it is that you're kind of talking about because again, I'm listening to you say, I'm listening to your argument, and I started off by saying that there's a bias against men, and generally speaking, and then you made the statement, and you said that men come into the system and they want to get custody of the child because they don't want to pay child support, or
some men,
right, some men, or that men,
a small fraction of that,
right,
in proportion to the general parent,
right, or you mentioned the subset of men that come in and say they don't want to have anything to do with the father or with the children, and that's viewed with disdain. So I guess at the root of all this, we're really talking about what this boils down to is a financial. People are being motivated by the financial component of entering into parenthood, especially when we're talking about out of wedlock births. So if you look at the state of Illinois, for a man, he pays 20 or 22% of his gross income for the first child, and then he pays an additional, I think it's 7% for the second child, and then it's an additional 5% up to the sixth child where it's capped. So you're talking about, you're talking about a law that's been codified where a man could potentially lose over 50% of his gross income if he had 6 children using that law. But again, those laws that were written by people who are state senators who are making $120,000 a year. So one could make the argument.
Let's be even clearer than that, David. I mean, a lot of the legislators don't necessarily have respect for their constituency.
Sure.
There's a presumption that everybody is a wage earner and has a regular job and has a fine education and lives in the suburbs and votes Republican. And we all know that's a bunch of malarkey.
Right.
The average working man and a lot of people that aren't working because of whatever circumstances have hit the state of Illinois, they want to be responsible, but they're paying or are saddled with child support obligations that are far in excess of their abilities to pay.
Correct.
There's no question about that.
Correct. So
these are honorable men, but they just I hate to say men. I mean honorable people, because there's women that pay child support too. Let's not forget that.
Well,
there are men that have custody and women that are responsible for having a child support obligation. The knife does cut both ways.
Well, again, going back to my original, and I'm glad you characterized it like that. They were talking about individuals legislators who don't necessarily identify with or respect their constituents. But having said that, if an individual, kind of to coattail on what you just said, that they could see themselves being responsible for in excess of 50% of their gross income, for the individual who wrote that law, who envisions themselves paying potentially 50% and they make 120, they could probably tell themselves, oh, if I was left with 60, I could still make it. But then to your point, to the guy who's out there who's making $30,000 and now he gets over 50, potentially over 50% of his income taken in a scenario where he's maxed out. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, where the perception at least is that it is anti-man when you talk about the family court system and how money is allocated for these children that are the non-custodial children of a father.
That's very true. That's very true. And one other thing that you're very astute in making that observation, David. And one other thing that your listeners may not be aware of. Let's say that there's a fellow that has several children from one woman, and then he has children from another woman. Let's say there's an instance where a man has 2 children with one lady. He's going to find that he has to pay 28% of his net take-home pay for those 2 children with the first lady. Now, let's say he goes out and he has another child with another person, another lady. He's going to find that not only does he have to pay 28% of his net take-home pay for the first 2 children, he's going to have to pay 20% of his net take-home pay for the child with the second person, and so on and so on. So unless you're in the NBA and you have a lot of multiple children, you may find that you're paying 20% on 20% on 20% or 20% on 30%. It's not a finite number if people have children from multiple relationships. And again, this is a payout schedule that's predicated on people making regular salaries.
Right. So
for the fellow that's not a entitled wage earner, it can be devastating. And we get emails all day long from guys like this.
Right, and to kind of further, let's even take it a step further. And again, and that's why I'm talking about specifically men, because when you start talking about a lot of the laws that were written, they were like you were talking about. You don't like the moniker of men's rights. Well, a lot of these laws that were written, especially in the state of Illinois, were written about 20, 25 years ago when the moniker out there was deadbeat dad. And it was the deadbeat dad kind of marketing ploy out there that created the law of fathers can lose their driver's licenses. Fathers can lose their passports.
Which is the most asinine thing in the world.
Well, comment on that.
You got a guy that's trying to make a living, maybe driving a truck or driving a cab or driving an Uber or in some business that involves driving a motor vehicle, and then he loses his license and he can't even make a living to pay the child support that's keeping him from having his license. I don't know who thought of this, but it's kind of like mothers against drunk drivers.
Right.
Women have have the ability to have a very loud voice, and I mean, to their credit, but a lot of the laws that have been enacted in the last 20 years have been formulated as the result of outrage.
Right.
And men, you're married, and many of your married guys will know, and I know this from divorce, the hardest cases to settle are when you represent a guy, because guys generally want to do the best. Guys want to give. It's always the woman that says, no, he's bad, he's a dog. And you run into this resentment and just a lot of angry women out there that don't want a fairness. They want a punitive action towards
them. Right. I mean,
and
let me just coattail on that.
And you find legislation has been enacted that way, because even when there were predominantly male legislatures, they've listened to all the women because the women have a louder voice about stuff like that. Guys want to coexist.
Right.
Women want to make a stink.
And in addition to, when you talk about loss of driver's licenses, loss of passports in the state of Illinois, if you are more than $30,000 or 3 years in arrears or behind in your child support, you can be sent to jail.
Oh,
how is that helping? And that's really the root of my question. The root of my question is, when you look at all of these, to use your word, that were born out of the marketing against quote unquote deadbeat dads, which to your point might have just been the function of a man not being financially capable enough to be responsible to the codified law that was passed, 20% of 20% of 20%, like you said earlier. How is it helping the child to your point, take the driver's license away from a father? Now he doesn't have a way to drive to work, or if he drives to work, to continue to work. How does it help the child to put the father in jail? How does it help the father? How does it help the child to take away the father's passport? Again, these just seem like, I would agree with you. These just seem like laws that were written because others were being the most vocal, and to your point, men are socially conditioned to really not complain, so they kind of just sat back. It's just really now that you're starting to hear men to kind of referencing the attorney that you mentioned that talks about men's rights.
Because frankly, it's politically incorrect to say things about women.
Right.
We love them, we admire them, we respect them.
They're our mothers and daughters and sisters,
and all the other stuff that goes with it. But
right.
He's nuts. When they get angry, all a guy wants to do is sit and watch TV, and it's up all night.
Right.
And it's just, and it's the same thing with the legislative actions and the actions that are taken by the legislature to serve or to placate the complaints of women.
Well, and again, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, but didn't we just come full circle, because we opened up the conversation talking about men's rights, and you kind of referenced the guy whose name we both know, who you say has kind of used that as a marketing ploy. But it sounds like we've kind of come full circle, because we've identified, I think, the root motivation and cause for a lot of why these laws were written, which was to placate women. So if these laws were written to placate women because they were the loudest, then isn't there a need for a men's rights agenda?
Listen, the fellow that says that he's in charge or is a proponent of men's rights isn't any more concerned with helping men than Donald Trump is with helping working people. He's the guy that got put over by the coal miners and people and factory workers in Michigan and Florida and all the people that do menial jobs down in the South. And they think that he's going to be a champion of the working people. Well, I want to see a Republican that does that. And I want to see a guy that's talking about men's rights, saying what he's going to do for men. No, you start out with a hostility. Now, I mean, I'm making certain observations, and I'm sure that my brethren and other people will be angry with what I have to say, but I believe it to be the truth. And I believe that in approaching a case, one has to consider the totality of the circumstances. Now, there's a new legislation that is going to be enacted in July. And what it is going to do is take a percentage of the respective parents' salaries and then commingle them to determine what the proper child support amount should be. It still puts an onus on men because, unfortunately, in our society, men make more money than women. And unfortunately, women that are saddled with children may not have the mobility or the ability to work as often or as frequent as often or at as well-paying jobs as men because they're taking care of children.
Sure.
But it does take into consideration the idea that you can't have a blanket percentage applied to any man when there are women that are making income as well, and both have a respective responsibility to providing a child. The biggest complaint guys have, I'm paying child support, I'm paying, let's say, $300 a week. I'm just going to pick a number. And I go to pick up my child, and my child's got shoes on that don't fit. Or my child has a coat that's too small. Or my child has got jeans with holes in them. Right. I mean, nowadays, I suppose kids buy jeans with holes in them, but I think you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And he says, where is my child support money going? Why is my money not being spent on my child? Why is my child in a condition like that? Why do I have to take my kid and buy a pair of gym shoes just to take them out because he's got shoes that don't fit? The child has shoes that don't fit their feet when I'm going to visitation.
Right.
And that's something that is probably the largest cause of animosity with child support paying fathers in the state of Illinois, is that the money they pay isn't going directly to the benefit of the child. And I don't know exactly how to remedy that. I really don't, because we have a presumption that everybody has a right to support their child, and we can only reduce it to a dollar amount. The proper standard should be how the money is allocated for the benefit of the child and not for the benefit of the mother. Yeah.
That's probably the best summation I've heard. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, when you have these blanket laws like we had, and I'm glad to hear about this change that's being made in the law, because if a man has a child with a woman and he makes $60,000 a year and the woman makes $30,000 a year, then he probably should pay X. But if a man is making $30,000 a year and the woman is making 60, then it's probably unfair that he should have to pay 20% in that set of circumstances. But certainly to your larger point, it seems to me that the responsibility of the court is to do what's best for the child. And all too often, and this is anecdotally now, just like your book of anecdotes, which I can't wait to read, by the way, but it seems like to me the court oftentimes does what's in the best interest of the most pugnacious parent rather than what is in the best interest of the child.
Yes, very true, very true. But men that are listening to your show, and I presume that you are speaking towards your male listeners by the topic that you have on here today. Men have to understand that they have a responsibility to participate in court proceedings. If you get a court summons, my goodness, go to court, show up.
Right.
If you don't understand what's going on, just say, I'm sorry, I don't understand. I got to see legal aid. I got to hire a lawyer. Don't go there and just expect the good graces of God to favor you just because you're a parent of a child. You've got to show up for court. You have to exercise some responsibility in your own defense. And the saddest thing that we always hear are people that will be sitting home and all of a sudden one day somebody's at the door. Right. And, they say, well, you owe $48,000 in child support because you haven't paid anything since 1982.
Right.
Wow. Then you got a problem. Then you got some real serious trouble. It's not dischargeable in a bankruptcy.
Right.
They can attach a 401k. There's all sorts of problems. They can attach pension benefits. Child support is a greater, what's the word I want to say? It is a greater danger to the solvency of men than the internal revenues.
And that needs to be addressed. Attorney Kurt Miller, we thank you for being on. Listen, we could definitely talk about this for another hour, without a doubt. We're going to definitely have you come back. Please tell our listeners really quickly how they can find you, how they can follow you.
David, you're very kind. Thank you. If people want to speak with us, we're available in Chicago at 312-467-6700. That's 312-467-6700. and they can catch us online at mullaw.com. That's Mullaw, mullaw.com. We have a website, we have phone numbers, and we're pretty easy to reach as long as we keep paying that phone bill.
Thank you very much for being on the show with us today on Humanity in the Headlines, and we will be in touch.
Thank you, my friend. Have a nice day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
That was a great conversation. I just want to end the show by saying to our people who are watching us on Facebook and those who are listening to us on the radio, we are not anti-woman on Humanity in the Headlines. My mother is a woman, my sister is a woman, and my fiance is a woman, and my daughter is a woman. So we want to just put that out there, but there definitely are some biases that are in the family law court system as it pertains to men and child support and the custody of their children, and we thought that was a topic that we wanted to cover today. Hey, we thank you for listening to us today on Intellectual Radio. We thank you for watching us on Facebook Live. Have a great week. We will be back with more on Humanity in the Headlines. Thank you and have a great week.